very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You have tuned to watch Saturday's edition of Diplomatic Faces. Now, talking about diplomacy or diplomatic relations, it does play a major and a pivotal role in our day-to-day lives. And diplomatic is something which is very important to all of us, and it is very important, in fact, for us to know what's happening in our local context and also in terms of the global aspect, because it's very important that we keep aware of what's happening around us. So, in Diplomatic Faces, we do always bring a new diplomatic face, and likewise, joining with us today is another new diplomatic face, and it's an honor and privilege to be here with Ms. Unna Mukoli, the Resident Coordinator for the United Nations and the Resident Representative for UNDP in Sri Lanka. A very good evening to you, Ms. Unna.
Good evening to you. Thank you for inviting me on the show.
It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
So, Ms. Unna, talking about United Nations, we do know that United Nations focuses on Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
It's also categorically like, let's say, poverty, namely gender equality, and so and so. So, talking about it, being the resident coordinator of the UN system in Sri Lanka, what exactly does your job entail here?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, my job is actually one where I have a different hat on almost every hour of the day. So I represent the Secretary General in Sri Lanka. I have a responsibility for coordinating the 14 UN agencies that are in Sri Lanka and 6 UN agencies outside Sri Lanka. I work on the big development issues. The Sustainable Development Goals gives us a fantastic framework for now thinking about integrating development and humanitarian work. I have a humanitarian responsibility. I have a responsibility for all UN staff in the country, but I also have a responsibility for ensuring that we talk about human rights, gender, poverty, and whatever the issues are of the day. But also I have an important support role in helping the government of the day to understand what are the key development lessons around the globe that perhaps could help Sri Lanka to accelerate its development.
So, no, there might be a reason as to why a particular person would choose a particular role or a particular job in the industry. So, what actually called you to work in the diplomatic service?
Well, funnily enough, nothing called me to work in the diplomatic service. I was very passionate about what I did. I have a background in child protection and the protection of displaced people, women's protection. And I had a boss who I admired greatly, and he was very dynamic. And he said to me, you have a lot of convening power, you have a lot of power to get people to work together. And I think you should be a representative, you should be in the diplomatic world, and eventually you should be a resident coordinator. At the time I thought that was quite funny because I had no ambition to do this. But actually, as time went on, I began to understand that having the ability to coordinate was something that I should use more and more broadly than just the areas that made me passionate. And now I'm coordinating on so many issues that make me passionate that quite often I don't even sleep at night because I'm thinking about all the things I want to do the next day. So it's really about a passion for coordination. But I also think the mandate of the UN Charter, which was about bringing people together at a time when the world wasn't in a good place and bringing nations together through the neutral space that is the UN, is really important. And so I think that being a UN coordinator and a UN diplomat in some ways is a much more interesting role than being a diplomat from a nation state, because I get to work with diplomats from all over the world in my job, as well as with my fantastic UN colleagues.
So definitely it's all to do with the passion which drives you
Absolutely.
to come and work as a resident coordinator.
Yeah.
And also now, the diplomatic service, it does have its own highlights and the challenges that you would face in a day-to-day work in this field.
Yeah.
So if you could give us examples of both in your tenure in this resident coordinator in Sri Lanka.
Wow. Again, I don't think that there can be any one highlight when you have my job, because there's highlights every single day. I think seeing young people graduate from good skills training projects, seeing young people involved in designing innovations that will help the country, seeing women who've been empowered and have their own income and can support their families, seeing people who didn't have a voice because the UN and the other parts of the infrastructure for development give them a voice. All of those are highlights. Seeing government come together to strengthen the voice of people who previously didn't have a voice, for me those are all highlights. I would say some of the biggest challenges really as a UN diplomat is that I must maintain neutrality at all times, and neutrality sounds so easy, but actually neutrality means something different to everybody. So if I say something on human rights, for example, there will always be people who say, oh my goodness, the UN has gone too far, that's not right, that's against our country. And there will be other people who are saying, why is she so timid? Why doesn't she speak out? Why doesn't the UN speak out on our issues? And for me, it's not about the rights and wrongs of those positions. It's about finding ways that we can bring those positions together and find a common solution for some of the challenges which do necessarily engender very different opinions. So neutrality is a challenge. I mean, it's also, I'm Irish. We don't really do neutrality. We do very strong opinions. And so always remembering that in this role, it's not about my opinions, it's about finding common ground for that neutrality that can help people to have conversations that will further development.
And it's definitely not a single rule which plays here. It's a group idea which comes along together with everyone.
Absolutely, and bringing ideas of many UN stakeholders, ideas of many government stakeholders, non-government stakeholders together.
So it's a process of basically looking into each and every aspect of everyone's needs and wants and their ideas, which collaborates to bring up one big solution, I believe.
Yeah, and ultimately in that, I'm sometimes the decision maker, and it's quite hard. You're sitting there, you're more or less on your own, and eventually at some point you have to say, this is the course of action we're taking. And again, you can be exposed to praise and you can be exposed to criticism. So I think the challenge is learning to accept both of those.
Definitely. And this all explains what are the challenges Zuna has to face and the highlights in terms of her tenure in this diplomatic relations. And Ms. Zuna, if I also may ask you about the events and the areas of work which have actually defined your interaction with the Sri Lankan government. How would you express your ideas on that?
I mean, I suppose in terms of my experiences and my time here, I think constantly learning how to adjust what the UN does, what the UN says, to try to ensure that we're helping move things forward, that we're trying always to keep conversations going, that we're trying not to shut doors. And the Sustainable Development Goals give us a really good framework for that, because they're broad, they're accepted and adopted by every country in the world, and they're common goals. In the past, when we had the Millennium Development Goals, which was very much people in governments in poor countries had to measure their progress towards statistical development. And now the SDGs count for every country. So Denmark, which comes first in everything, happiest country, richest country, best social services, they also have to improve. They also have to make sure life is better for their citizens. So we're all in one big framework now. And so finding ways to put Sri Lanka into that global framework is part of my work. But there's also the challenges of saying Sri Lanka was doing really well in the MDGs. We had fantastic statistical development, but now Sri Lanka will we'll have to think a lot more about what sustainable development means. So these are some of the exciting ways forward. And, you know, suddenly when you see someone in a NGO or someone in government whose eyes light up and say, wow, the sustainable development framework is great. These goals are going to really move Sri Lanka forward. You know, you've had a good day. I think one of the most influential people in my time here was actually my predecessor, who, as I told you, the Irish are quite prone to react rather than think. You know, he always said to me, when there's a challenge, close the door, think about it, consult, think about it again, consult again, write the email, leave the email in your draft, and then come back to it later. And several people have actually, I think, given me that same message and often helped me to actually become a better diplomat through that.
And improve your ideas every time you
consult and every time you let those things lie. I think for me, a very personal moment for me when I realized I was in the right country at the right time. I had been very sick in 2015 and I'd had surgery, and I'd stayed very quiet about it because I didn't want to upset anyone. And I went back to the office. I was working at UNICEF at the time, and I went back to the office and the entire team was in the lobby. And I thought, oh my God, this is the most terrible moment in my life. But anyway, I started crying, and then everybody else started crying. And then one by one, everybody in the office came and hugged me. And it didn't matter that it was a receptionist or my deputy, or it was a man or a woman or a Muslim or a Sinhala or a Buddhist or a Tamil or a Hindu or a Christian. Everybody in the office hugged me. And I thought, my goodness, could anyone be anywhere better? Not only is this a team of UN people who care so much about what they do, but they actually care about each other, and they care about this stranger in their country so much that even people who are very uncomfortable hugging me wanted to be part of that. And so for me, since that moment, I've never had any question that I'm in the right country and doing the right thing. But I think other experiences would be to see people in civil society, in academia, in government, who defend and give a voice to the voiceless. And I think just watching them doing that also means coming to work every day is a pleasure.
It was definitely nice to hear that Sri Lankans have such a lovely community where they help each other and, you know, stand for each other when someone is in trouble. And like you also mentioned, that sometimes people also have to develop that skill where they have to stand by another person when they're actually falling in trouble and try to uplift that person to someone better. And also, Ms. Una, if I come across the question as, is there any particular experience, a person or an event in Sri Lanka that has greatly influenced your decisions in your policies?
I remember hearing a little girl in Batikaloa talking about what she wanted for the future some years ago, and I think she was about half my size. And I remember thinking, even though it was through translation, thinking, if this child can be this articulate about the future that she wants for her country, a country where girls are treated equally, a country where peace is considered the norm, a country where everybody, even children from poor communities, have access to the best education and can make the best choices for the future for their country, then I wish I had been that little girl when I was 8 or 9 or whatever she was, but I need to be the best representative of the UN system for her and the boys and girls that she was representing. So I don't even remember her name, I'm embarrassed to say, but I remember that moment of this incredible power of this little girl describing what she wanted for her peaceful, sustainable and prosperous Sri Lanka.
So the basic idea would be that there are so many people out there, like little kids, who actually need a help, a better hand to sort of come up in life, but that they are not looked after. But a community like this could always help them,
Yeah.
to grow in their lives. So how many such people have you come across
Yeah.
in your career?
Wow. I mean, I would say about that little girl, help is a kind of word that suggests that good people do things for other people, but I think assistance to reach potential of communities, of children, of women, of men who are in dire straits because of poverty or whatever reason. So I think it's about assistance and partnership. I think the UN is a partner in Sri Lanka now. I mean, I've had a very long career. You see the wrinkles and the signs of old age, but I've seen a lot of people in distress, and I've seen a lot of people who, given the right support, also have solutions. But that's where the UN community, with civil society, with government, need to work together to say, what are the best lessons learned and what support can be given to accelerate the development and situation for those people so they can reach their potential.
Definitely, with the help of the UN and the government and everyone else together,
Yeah.
we can definitely look forward to a better future for the young
Yeah.
kids out there. And also now, the former UN Secretary General, who's Mr. Dag Hammarskjöld, said that the United Nations was created not to lead mankind, but to heaven to save humanity from the hell. That was something which he quoted. Now, in its 70 years from now, the United Nations may have been hailed as the great hope for the futures of the mankind. So how would you define the UN's role in the upcoming future in the 21st century?
Yeah. Before this interview, I reread the UN Charter, and it mentions the 2 world wars. But actually, if it didn't mention the 2 world wars, it's almost as relevant today in terms of the rest of the vocabulary than it was 70 years ago. And I think we would all acknowledge the world isn't in necessarily a very good place or a very comfortable place. I think we've witnessed in Sri Lanka the signs of global warming. We've seen temperatures that are through the roof. We've seen icebergs melting. We've seen the acceleration of climate change as we didn't expect it. We've seen in many ways conflicts that are as vicious, as violent and as big as those world wars that Dag Hammarskjöld was referring to. And we've seen a breakdown to some extent in the traditional politics of those post-Second World War era. We've seen surprise election results. We've seen people lose faith in their politicians globally. And we are in a position where a lot of the old truths are changing. The global centers of power are changing. And that leaves a lot of uncertainty. It makes a lot of people nervous, and it also creates an environment where if we don't work together, extremism can fill the void. Whether that's religious extremism or violence or people becoming more fragmented and more individualistic. And so I think that as the only global governance structure, because the UN that's what it is, it's an intergovernment global UN governance structure, I think the UN is the only hope. But I think that also means the UN has to work hard to remain relevant, to be fit for purpose, to be able to tackle these new challenges, because the challenges of the world are changing, and they're changing ever more quickly. Just the world of work. A 15-year-old now has no idea what the world of work will look like when she or he is 35, 40, and robots have replaced many jobs. We have to be almost ahead of times, and I think the UN has a reputation of being a bit slow and a bit behind times. And our new Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, is really pushing us really very, very hard to reform at every level, to become more relevant, to become not only support to those sustainable development goals that we talked about, but also support to sustaining peace worldwide. And those are two big agendas, sustaining peace and the sustainable development goals. And protecting our planet. So, you know, we've got this huge responsibility, but we have to change and we have to become better at what we do. But I do think as that one global governance structure, for the time being, the UN is the only international stage that can bring all of the countries of the world together to try to agree on some of these big agendas.
And Ms. Zuna, now with this uncertainty which is created in the local and the global context, how do you see the future? Like now also you did mention that, you know, by around take 20 years from now or 30 years from now, a 15-year-old might not know where she's heading to.
Yeah.
So with this uncertainty, what do you see the future like? Is it towards the betterment of the society, or are they trying to improve it day by day? How would you comment on that?
I mean, I can only be optimistic about where we're going. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any point in me coming to work. And so I think people will wake up to the challenges of climate change. They will wake up to the challenges of how we look after our planet, how we look after each other. People will start to think about how they consume the world's resources. And people will start to think about what does income look like in the future. We've seen some really interesting and surprising new developments. Some of the countries in the north and a few countries in the south experimenting now with universal income, acknowledging that unemployment or underemployment or volunteerism is going to become a big part of how we use our time in the future. Caring for elderly people, it's going to become a big part of what we do in the future. They're looking at new ways of redistributing wealth. So I think that there's a lot that's very positive. I think what the UN and the governments around the world need to do is to continue to tell the good news and the good stories about what can change positively, because otherwise we fall back into positions of nationalism, protectionism, fragmentationism, and we will see a growing discontent. You know, one of my greatest worries is screen time and the amount of time that not just young people now, but everybody spends on screens, and how limited social interaction is. So encouraging people to talk to each other and use the new technologies to talk to each other, to learn from each other, rather than for some of the either very narcissistic uses that social media has, or for the, you know, the bad side of the internet, which is this dark web where new types of global crime are emerging. So there's so many challenges, and you can only be optimistic and you can only keep encouraging.
I think that is that point which you mentioned was something which we all see in our lives now, where a lot of people out there have been interacted through the social media, but in the way they use it, you know, let it be, it's just maybe to interact with few people, but they're not really being updated, not trying to update themselves on what's happening, what's the current context, what's happening around them.
Yeah.
But it's just a matter of that they use it maybe for different other purposes and eventually ruin their lives. But if people also could make them aware of how to use it efficiently and in a proper way, then they maybe could, I mean, use it in a proper way and gain something out of it.
Yeah. No, and I think it's a lot of times the rewards that people get from social media are very individualistic, and it's about finding ways to use social media so the rewards that you feel good about yourself, that you feel good about other people, that you feel a kind of collective well-being. We need to get better at that, because if people just feel rewarded because 20 people say they like what you're wearing, it's not taking us anywhere. Yeah. And what we really need to do is come together collectively to work together for our planet and our collective humanity.
Definitely. Ms. Zuna, also your term as the resident coordinator in Sri Lanka has been marked by a lot of factors, like namely educational, human rights, and humanitarian and development programs. How do you actually evaluate the importance of these programs for the United Nations and for you personally?
Wow. It's another huge question. I mean, I think that everything the United Nations does in Sri Lanka is valid. We're 14 agencies here and 6 agencies who are non-resident. We call them, they don't have representatives here, but they work with us.
Okay.
And we all have different mandates. We all have different goals and objectives to help different parts of the development agenda, different parts of the population, different ministerial roles, different roles of civil society. And they're important on the whole spectrum. The UN is a big spectrum of work, from pure humanitarian work through development, through human rights, political work, and in countries in trouble with peacekeeping missions. So we work along that entire spectrum of development and humanitarianism here, and the human rights spectrum. None of those things can be seen separately. So you can't have, for example, sustainable development without women's empowerment, because development that's done by a minority of the population, which is men, for the whole population will never have the balance that development done by men and women will have. You can't have good quality education without having attractive prospects for university and jobs in the future. You can't have humanitarian assistance where people in trouble continue to receive assistance without policies that look for long-term solutions. You can't have activists for human rights without human rights, and you can't have development or education or anything else without basic human rights. So all of it's important, and I think the government understands the totality of that importance. Finding time to bring everything together is really challenging. We're just the UN, we're just a bunch of up to 900 people in the country, and we find it difficult to bring all of that together. And that's our job. So for governments who have to run a country, the challenge is much bigger, and so our support to that is important, I think.
And also about the point of women empowerment. What sometimes people get is a wrong impression that they're trying to just make the women sort of rule the country or rule certain things. That's what I mean, we've heard from different other people when you say women empowerment. But how can you actually differentiate that it's not about them being just feminist, but something more than that? I believe it's about collaboration of both the genders, is it?
Absolutely, and I think sometimes we use the word feminist as if it was something a little bit tricky, but you know, being a feminist is about believing that women should vote, women shouldn't be harassed, women should have an equal say, women should have the same opportunities as men, and there's very little that's controversial about that. However, having said that, I'm the first woman to hold this post in Sri Lanka, and that's representing the Secretary General of an organization that believes in women's empowerment and believes in women's equality. And so, to some extent, I feel as the first woman in my post, I have a real responsibility to the women in the UN system, the women in civil society, the women in government who I come in contact with, to be a role model. And that doesn't mean I have to be more like the men than the men. It doesn't mean I have to be more like a woman than a woman. I have to be true to myself and my principles. And I have to try to find ways of ensuring that women's voices are heard. And that's no disrespect to my male colleagues, but in particular to women and young women in the UN, trying to ensure that for the time that they're in the UN, we foster their leadership skills, because I look forward to seeing the young women in the UN who are learning now, going out and becoming key and important decision makers in government or in business later on. And I see the UN as an important place for them to learn and practice some of those skills, as well as contribute to the development of the country.
Make it the platform to bring themselves up and start that. Yeah.
And that's the same goes for young men and older colleagues, but I think in particular in a country like Sri Lanka, where there isn't a balance necessarily between the participation of women and men, we can play a role here. And as the first woman resident coordinator, I have chosen to champion that.
Definitely. And also now, prior to your appointment as the resident coordinator, you served as the UNICEF representative for Sri Lanka for 4 years. So how do you facilitate the exchange between the UN and the government of Sri Lanka?
Well, you know, as I was saying, we have all these different agencies in Sri Lanka. Each of them has their own mandates, and many of them have their own partners in line ministries, in government. And most of the time, when agencies are working on their specific areas of work, they would work directly with a ministry without our facilitation. The fact that the UN is what we call an intergovernment organization, many people don't know that. Many people think the UN is either works for the government in the country it's in, or that we're a big NGO. We're actually an intergovernment organization, and that gives us a lot of credibility with the government. So we have very good access to ministers, secretaries, DGs, chief ministers in the country. And so most of my colleagues have their own relationships. So ILO would have good relationships with the Ministry of Employment. Food and Agriculture would have a good relationship with the Ministry of Agriculture. UN Women, UNICEF would have a good relationship with Women and Children, the Ministry of Women and Children, refugees, with resettlement. But there are also times when we work collectively. So when we design our program framework, so we have a new program which will start in 2018, it's 5 years, and it's an expression of what the UN will do together with the government. Then we coordinate with the government together, and I lead those discussions about what does the government want, what does civil society want the UN to do to support the government, and then we negotiate collectively, and I lead that. We also have times when we feel there's a need to work together, several agencies, because if we work together we strengthen the advice or the programming that we can offer to the government. And so where more than 2 or 3 agencies work together, I tend to support the dialogue on that. So normally there we would work together, we would sit down, discuss, decide what our common messages are, write them out, work on them, work on what we hope to achieve, what evidence we're bringing to the table to explain why we think an idea is good or why we think an idea is not good, and then look at how we would represent those ideas best. And often that means that I initiate the discussion with the government, but then my colleagues just take the discussion forward at a technical level later on. But we also have formal mechanisms for engaging with the government. So we have a steering committee that helps us to monitor that we're doing what we say we'll do, because we work to a 5-year plan. And we have regular briefings with senior members of the government to keep them briefed on what we're doing and to make sure that we're actually addressing priorities of the government. But in my role as representative of the Secretary General here, I also try to facilitate the engagement of the country with the broader UN. So when we have high-level visitors, we discuss what's going to be said or agreed, and when politicians and government and civil society are traveling to UN events outside the country, then we try to make sure that they can maximize their exposure to the UN, whether it's in New York or Geneva or Bonn or Vienna, wherever the headquarters are, or even to regional UN hubs like Bangkok or Nairobi, and that we ensure that the maximum amount of learning about what's happening in Sri Lanka and about what's happening elsewhere takes place. So there's no one way that we engage with government, but there are many ways.
Many ways, that's...
And we decide how, depending on the context.
And also talking about something very important is the academic qualifications that you have actually mastered in so many master's in degree in international development and bachelor's degree in social science and science research from the University of East London. So looking back at your career, is there any single achievement which you are actually maybe proud of, thinking about it?
Well, I think first just on academic qualifications, you know, at the time it's abstract, and then there's a period in your life when you don't really reflect on your academic qualifications. You're just busy learning about your environment. And then you get to a more mature point in life where you start to realize that your academic learning and your experiential learning are very important. And I think I look now and I think about what I learned at university 30 years ago, and what I realize is that now so much of that is relevant, even though it was a long time ago. But I didn't know that 15 years ago, and I kind of wish that 15 years ago I had had the maturity to stop and reflect on how the different parts of my life fit together. So thank you for asking about my academic qualifications. But I'm still learning. I'm doing another master's because I believe that as a UN representative, I need to model lifelong learning to my colleagues, and that keeps my mind agile. So that's important. I think my single proudest achievement has absolutely nothing to do with Sri Lanka and has absolutely nothing to do with this job. But it was going back a long time ago in West Africa when I was working in Liberia, where 2 wars, one in Liberia and one in Sierra Leone, had impacts on 5 countries regionally. And there were child soldiers, separated children, people in distress living in those 5 countries who'd run away from Liberia and Sierra Leone. And we realized in Liberia that we were doing some cutting edge protection work, trying to reunite families, trying to bring former child soldiers back to families, finding ways of integrating them despite all the terrible things they'd seen and done. And we realized that some people were doing the same in Sierra Leone, and other people were trying to do the same in Guinea, and other people were trying to do the same in Ivory Coast. And we told our bosses, we want to work together. And they said, oh no, you know, if you do a project application, it has to just be for this country. Donors don't like you to spend money in other countries. You can't do that because we don't have the bureaucracy for it. And we, before Skype, before anything, just with satellite telephones, we got together and we said, this is nonsense, this is about people. And we found a way as young professionals in 5 countries to persuade our bosses that they were wrong. And we brought child protection networks of government officials, NGOs, UN, and even young people themselves together. And we brought women's protection networks with the same compositions together. And we created a 5-country protection program, which reunited thousands of children with their families, reunited thousands of mothers with their children, moved thousands of women out of danger. And we did it because we all believed in one objective, and we all believed that it was the right thing to do. And to this day, that network still exists, and nobody thinks it's a stupid idea anymore. Nobody says the bureaucracy can't handle this, the donors won't like it. It's just assumed that that's the way to work. So for me, changing a paradigm, I think it's probably the only time I was actually a leader in changing an entire paradigm, has to be, of course, the crowning moment.
The crowning moment would have been like something really good. And Ms. Unamakoli, thank you very much for joining us. It was indeed a great pleasure to have you with us, and it was, of course, a great discussion where we spoke about a lot of things, a lot of issues, a lot of factors, the pros and cons of what the current world is facing, like, and especially in terms of the Sri Lankan context. And thank you very much again. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me anytime.
So joined with us was Ms. Unamakoli, the resident coordinator for the United Nations and the resident representative for UNDP in Sri Lanka. So ladies and gentlemen, this was a wrap of the Saturday's edition of Diplomatic Faces. So as usual, next week also we'll be bringing another new diplomatic face. So till then, so bye-bye from Vidushini.